Hello again, everyone, and welcome to yet again another edition of Alaska Weather. First, on the hazardous weather graphic here, we've got warnings out for the northern Seward Peninsula, the northwest coast, Kotzebue Sound, Noatak Valley area. That's a winter storm warning out for Tuesday afternoon through Wednesday. Possible 6 to 8 inches of snow falling with winds gusting to 50 miles per hour, and that could reduce visibility to less than a quarter mile at times in the blowing snow. And then down to the south, northeast Prince William Sound, there right under the Valdez red dot. That's a high wind warning out for tonight and Tuesday for 40 to 60 mile per hour wind gusts. Then we have high wind warnings out for the Klondike Highway up to Skagway, Juneau area, Juneau Borough. And that's for northeast winds gusting 40 to 70 miles an hour as well. Taking a little closer look at those. High wind warning in effect for the Prince William Sound area, Valdez, Thompson Pass, Keystone Canyon, those areas. Northeast winds 40 to 50, gusts possibly to 75 miles per hour expected. And mostly around the Valdez and Thompson Pass areas, but any channeled area there will have strong winds, and that's from 9 p.m. tonight through 9 p.m. Tuesday. And the next graphic here showing a closer up view, more detailed view of the high wind warning for Juneau and Douglas. Winds off the East Mountains will lead to gusts across the channel near downtown, kind of a gravity flow type of situation there with 60 to 70 mile per hour gusts expected there. 60 miles an hour Douglas, Juneau 62 miles an hour, and Eagle Crest up to about 43 miles per hour. And from there, looking at satellite imagery, system pushing from Bristol Bay across Kodiak Island now, tracking off to the southeast at a pretty good clip, and the snow starting to taper off across Kodiak this afternoon, lightening up from what it was earlier today, and has ended for the most part over Bristol Bay. Clear cold conditions over much of interior Alaska, and then a big wound-up storm way out there to the west, tracking due north off the east coast of Kamchatka Peninsula, now moving inland over the Russian Far East, and that front pushing mostly to the north with not much eastward progress there. You can see a lot of kind of loose cloudiness there over the central western Aleutians, and mid and high level clouds spilling in toward the Pribilofs there, with more westerly flow. Otherwise, pretty dry for the Alaska Peninsula today, and all the way up to the Arctic coast as well. But the clouds on the increase, the mid and high level clouds now reaching the coastal areas, central and north coast of the Panhandle. As you can see, that system bringing, again, anywhere up to 6 to 8 inches of snow across at the Kodiak State Airport. Lighter amounts down to the southwest, Akiak, and but Port Lions and Kodiak State Airport and the city of Kodiak had a good snowfall today. Same thing Bristol Bay earlier overnight when that came through. They had about anywhere from 4 to 6 inches around King Salmon, northeast Bristol Bay there. But that system already moving off to the east-southeast, and high pressure, strong high pressure over interior Alaska, making for clear skies, temperatures well below zero all the way down into south central Alaska, and gusty winds, Resurrection Bay and Prince William Sound area through the northern gaps and the Copper River Delta. Winds starting to increase later tonight there for the northern panhandles. You see that low tracks off to the southeast, southwest of the Queen Charlottes. That high continues to strengthen there right around the Eagle area, centered more or less around Eagle, but up to 1,050 millibars now. And that equals 31 inches even on of mercury on an altimeter. Anyway, that'll increase those winds over the northern panhandle there with dry conditions, a little colder temperatures, and the eastern Bering Sea, not much going on there with basically light winds and dry conditions. Warm front brings some possible moisture to the western Aleutians. Then tomorrow, that front tracking northeastward there edges eastward enough to bring increasing snow and wind St. Lawrence Island, Bering Strait coast, as well as the Point Hope Cape Lisburne area, maybe Kivalina, maybe a few flurries along the central eastern Arctic coast, but if that does occur, it'll be pretty negligible. Otherwise, clear cold conditions over all of interior Alaska, maybe some clouds up to the north, mid and high level clouds, Brooks Range, but dry conditions all the way down across the Panhandle. Most of that snow should stay in Dixon Entrance. Just a slight risk it could get up in toward Heidelberg area or Annette Island, but or Metlakatla for that matter. And then possible rain out over the western Aleutians. heaviest there with that warm front right across Kiska, maybe to Adak, with just a chance of some moisture there for the Unimak Island area. And then for the day on Wednesday, that front tracks eastward now, bringing snow into the western interior. Milder conditions, so mixed precipitation, lighter winds, and warmer temperatures, St. Lawrence Island. It looks like snow moving into the Kuskokwim Valley, as far east of the Kuskokwim Valley in the afternoon, and into the central interior, but looks like snow will cover areas of the Brooks Range, North Slope, and the Arctic coast, with that low tracking just east of the central Arctic coast late in the afternoon. High pressure weakening, but sliding southeastward there into British Columbia. That's going to keep it dry and cold over the Panhandle, but the gradient less now. A little bit more wind down over the southern southeast coast, with less wind up to the north. Light winds over the North Gulf coastal areas, and then a chance of rain or showers, cloudy skies over much of the southeast Bering Sea, central eastern Aleutians, possible light rain into the western Alaska Peninsula. Dry for Kodiak Island. Lows tonight, teens and 20s for the Panhandle. A little chilly there in the Copper River Basin, northern Kuskokwim Valley, 20 to 25 below. McCarthy could be closer to 30 below, and right around zero. So sit in the Matanuska Valley, down into the Kenai Peninsula, anywhere from 0 to 15 below, and 13 for Homer. And for the highs tomorrow, mid-30s Kodiak Island, teens Bristol Bay, below zero for the most part for the Kuskokwim Valley, Copper River Basin, in the lower teens, south central Alaska, mid-20s Homer, and highs upper teens northern Panhandle, otherwise in the 20s, followed by lows mid-minus 20s again for the Copper River Basin, and 10 to 20 below for the Kuskokwim Valley, 0 to 10 above for Bristol Bay, 25 Kodiak Island. Call it 15 below to 15 above for the Kenai Peninsula and the Matanuska and Susitna Valley areas, followed by highs in the teens, upper 20s for the Panhandle, below zero Copper River Basin, teens for the Susitna Valley to the Kenai Peninsula, upper 30s now for Kodiak Island. Lows up north, cold night tonight, some areas approaching 40 below over the northeast interior, followed by highs staying well below zero, except pushing warmer air coming up, 30 for St. Lawrence Island, mid-teens for the central Arctic coast, followed by lows, a little milder, but still far below zero there for the mid-upper Tanana Valley and the 40-mile country into the Yukon Flats to Arctic Village, but warmer out to the west, 20s for the Bering Strait and St. Lawrence Island, and highs Wednesday afternoon. Still a little below zero, but warmer, mid-20s for the for the central Arctic coast, western Arctic coast, 25 to 30, lower 30s for the Seward Peninsula, mid-30s St. Lawrence Island, 0 to 10 for the central interior areas. Out to the southwest, cold along the southwest coast tonight, mid-30s for the Pribilos, followed by highs in the upper 40s for the Aleutians, followed by lows in the teens and 20s, 40s for the Aleutians.
Hello from Southeast Alaska. I'm meteorologist Grant Smith with the National Weather Service here in Juneau, Alaska, with a weather briefing for those of you in Southeast Alaska over the next 5 days. So for starters, a high wind warning will be in effect on Tuesday for strong winds, upwards of 60 to 70 miles per hour wind gusts. That's going to be for the Skagway and downtown Juneau areas. Now, if you are not in the Skagway or downtown Juneau area, we're still going to be seeing some strong winds, just not up to the threshold of 60 to 70 miles per hour. And this is going to be in effect at 3 a.m. Tuesday to 9 p.m. Tuesday, and the biggest impacts will be potential for the blown over trees or power lines, and also causing for some difficult travel in the area. So the overall weather pattern, what we're thinking is a high pressure over northern Alaska will move to the east-southeast, and as that pattern sets up, it's going to drive some northerly winds through the Panhandle, bringing us those strong gusty winds, but also some very cold air. We're looking at highs in the teens and 20s, starting with the south, highs on Tuesday and Wednesday. 15 for Petersburg, 26 for Port Alexander, 27 in Heidelberg, all on Tuesday. Very similar story for Wednesday, so some very cold air in the south. Then in the north, very similar story. Highs will be in the teens and 20s. Juneau, a high of 18 degrees, Angoon 16, Sitka 20 degrees on Tuesday, and then that story continues into Wednesday as well. Then the overnight lows, Tuesday night and Wednesday night, It'll be very cold, single digits and teens. And yes, that is near record low temperatures. So we have near record low temperatures in the forecast for the middle of the week. So your 5-day outlook, minor impacts at the start because of the strong winds and cold air. But as that high pressure moves into British Columbia and farther away from the southeast, that's going to lighten the pressure. So the wind gusts should calm down, and also temperatures should warm up just ever so slightly. But stay plugged into the forecast over the next few days on weather.gov/Juneau as we bring you the latest over the next few days. For the National Weather Service in Juneau, Alaska.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Segment. IFR widespread from St. Lawrence Island down across the central eastern Bering Sea. All of the Aleutians into the Alaska Peninsula, IFR. Interior Alaska, nothing but VFR from the west coast to the eastern border and from the Arctic coast all the way down to the North Gulf Coast. Cape St. Elias there looks like could see some marginal VFR possibly, but that condition staying off the southeast coast. Kodiak Island, marginal VFR. Definitely an improvement from what you're seeing today. And for the Tuesday afternoon forecast, VFR, interior Alaska. Now, some marginal VFR along the central eastern Arctic coast. Still a lot of IFR out over the Bering Sea from St. Lawrence Island down to the Pribilofs, but now some spotty areas of marginal VFR showing up like around the Fox Islands and Adak, and even further improvement out toward Chimianatu. VFR, Kodiak Island, North Gulf Coast, all of the Panhandle, and moving on to Wednesday morning. IFR starting to make a move there over the Bering Sea, now pushing into the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta area and northward, more widespread now into western Seward Peninsula, possibly to Nome. Marginal VFR to about Golovin. Interior Alaska, south of the Brooks Range, though, VFR. And marginal VFR starting to work its way in across Bristol Bay to maybe King Salmon. And some marginal VFR coming into southern Kodiak Island, mostly Sitginak, VFR to the north. And then band of marginal VFR maybe up to Yakutat. But pretty good conditions. Let's just call it VFR for the North Gulf Coast and the Panhandle. And then Thursday morning, start to see a big change. A lot of moisture pushing into the central northern interior, so a lot of IFR coming with that, moving from west-southwest to east-northeast, hanging up along the western Alaska Range there. So areas east and south of the Alaska Range, no change. That maybe was an increase in the mid and high-level moisture, cloudiness, but staying VFR. And maybe marginal for the for Yakutat, Panhandle staying VFR. A lot of IFR out over the Bering Sea, including the Aleutians, but the Alaska Peninsula mostly marginal. Kodiak Island, marginal VFR in areas. And for Anatuvik, looking good for VFR flying for Anatuvik and Atigan. And for Lake Clark and Merrill, good VFR, rainy VFR, windy VFR. In fact, all the passes in interior Alaska will be VFR for the day on Tuesday. Mentasta included, Course Tanita VFR, Portage VFR, Chilkoot and White looking good VFR. Freezing levels, kind of warmer air surging northward there into the central Bering Sea. You can see 6,000 feet there northwest of the Pribilofs and 8,000 feet just south of Atka Island. And icing, areas of light to isolated moderate rime icing streaming northeastward there, spilling into western St. Lawrence Island, the Bering Strait, and the western Arctic coast areas to maybe Kivalina, and then back down toward the west central Aleutians, higher freezing levels, so you got to get up to about 8,000 feet to worry about it there. Otherwise, icing free over the remainder of the state, and including the Panhandle. And jet stream, area high pressure at 33,000 feet there, just near the Fox Islands, western Alaska Peninsula. Southwest flow going up and over the top of that into the northwest interior, turning northerly, about 85 to 95 knots there from say the Koyukuk Valley down into the Gulf of Alaska, and even stronger coming down across Yakutat. And at 9,000 feet, east-northeast, 35 to 55 knots for the northern Panhandle, eastern North Gulf Coast. Southerlies out over the Bering Sea or southwesterlies, 45 to 65 knots. Strongest there still west over the Russian Far East. And looking at 3,000 feet, high pressure, Northwest Territories in over central interior Alaska, extending southward there across Kodiak, and that keeping southerly flow, south-southwest flow over the central Aleutians up to St. Lawrence Island, 50 knots just west of St. Matthew Island, and southwest 45 knots there into the Cape Lisburne, Point Hope, Point Lay area on the Arctic coast, and a little brisk there on the eastern Arctic coast. And the Panhandle, 65 knots blowing up toward Yakutat and the north coast of the Panhandle, about 35 out of this northeast, though, for the Prince William Sound area, Valdez, and those locations. Turbulence, moderate chop, Panhandle, and the western Brooks Range.
Space weather affects technologies. As conditions develop, we put out alerts, warnings, and watches to our customers so they can take action.
The Space Weather Prediction Center has had a long-standing relationship with the power industry, so they've been aware that solar storms, the geomagnetic storm piece of that, can affect the operation of systems and induce extra currents and loads on those systems that can either trip those systems offline or in the worst of cases, cause damage. That relationship goes back for several decades. In fact, a big incident in 1989 where part of Quebec was tripped offline that affected something like 6 million customers for about 9 hours. I think that really raised the awareness in the power industries.
When we get the alert, we watch the grid and start looking for issues. Are we seeing a decline in voltage? Are we seeing equipment failures? And we readjust the system to try to mitigate those problems, try to keep the lights on and keep it from going out.
We're averaging about 500, 550 kilometers per second.
If we didn't have this early warning, we wouldn't see it until our sensor saw it. Getting more information quicker and faster before the storm hits, not during the storm, is a big improvement.
In the long term, I think what we need and what we're moving toward, the U.S. as a whole, is better modeling, fully understanding this phenomenon, understanding how it would impact specific systems.
Rather than actually experiencing a storm, we can simulate storms in our software and see what the impact is. We try to get ahead of it. We always plan that if there's an outage, how can we keep the lights on? What's the best process to prevent it?
In the end, 5, 10 years from now, there's going to be a whole mix of operational procedures driven by what we do on prediction and warning. And then there also will probably be some level of hardware controls to ensure the reliability of the grid.
Space weather affects technologies. As conditions develop, we put out alerts, warnings, and watches to our customers so they can take action.
There's different types of impacts on communication systems, and the HF we call the high frequency, which is that band of communications 3 to 30 megahertz. But it's a very important band of radio communication because it's used widespread. It's used, for example, by the airlines.
HF radio is most commonly used for position reporting when you're going across the ocean airspace, which is devoid of radar, and ATC can't see you, so it's up to you to report your position and your altitude and your speed.
HF works great most of the time, except during a big flare. And during a big flare, that HF communication capability could be gone within a minute or two. So as soon as we see something happening in there or we see a flare, it's one of the first things we do is alert the aviation community, hey, big flare, HF's going to be impacted.
Once we know that there's an event going on, then the aviation industry and the airlines can react to that. They can alter their routes over the poles. They can lower the altitudes that they're flying at, or maybe decide not to fly at all in the interest of their passenger safety.
So that's just one example of how AHF is used, but the emergency response community will use it a lot too. It's one of their primary backups.
When you've lost connectivity between certain government agencies, it gives you that long-range coverage to talk from out of state to federal governments or from the FEMA locations to the state emergency operations centers.
So if you've got a big hurricane impact in the coastline, whatever big city, we've got the cell towers down and whatnot. We've got emergency communication folks in there. Those folks are very familiar with space weather and how it impacts their systems.
Here in recent years, it was used during Katrina when we had a lot of communications outages down there. It was also used during Hurricane Ike. There was an outage of the telephone circuits with the Texas State Emergency Office, so it was used in both of those situations.
So when we talk about backup, especially for the airlines, typically they'll have SATCOM, so that'll be satellite communication.
The satellite technology that emergency responders use could be GPSs, could be satellite phones, satellite data terminals.
Space weather events can impact SATCOMs. The impact can range from a nuisance to loss of a spacecraft. So we will give them the heads up. If we have space weather events, flares, whatnot, they need to know what's impacting their systems. Situational awareness is key. Time is of essence to these folks. Again, it's life and death.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome back. Looking at coastal water forecast. Good gales across much of the panhandle for the day Tuesday. On the north coast, northeast winds 40 to 45 knots. And the south coast, north to northeast winds 35 knots. Lynn Canal, north wind sustained 45 knots, seas at around 9 feet. And Stevens Passage, north winds at 40 knots. Clarence Strait, north winds 30, gusting 45 knots. And for the outlook on Wednesday, gale warnings continue. North winds 40 knots for Lynn Canal, Glacier Bay, Stevens Passage, seas running 7 to 10 feet. Clarence Strait, north winds 35 knots with 7-foot seas. And on the south coast, north winds 40 knots, seas around 20 feet. And then lighter winds on the north coast, out of the north still, but at 25 to 35 knots. Prince William Sound for Tuesday, north winds 25 knots, seas 5 feet. And for the North Gulf Coast, small craft advisories, north to northeast winds 25 to 30 knots. Barren Islands, north winds 30 knots. Kamishak Bay on Tuesday, north winds 25 knots. And northeast at 20 for Southern Cook Inlet, north of 15, north of the Forelands. For Wednesday, Cook Inlet, north to northeast winds 10 to 20 knots, 3 to 5 foot seas. Gale warnings for Kamishak Bay. Winds out of the northwest 40 knots with 10 foot seas, and gale warnings for the Barren Islands. West winds 35 knots. And for the North Gulf Coast, looking at north to northwest winds 20 to 30 knots, and Prince William Sound, north winds coming down to 15 knots with 3 foot seas. Kodiak Island, small craft advisories, north winds 25 knots for Tuesday. And for the Alaska Peninsula, east winds 10 to 15 knots, 4 to 7 foot seas. Bristol Bay, northeast winds of 15 knots and seas at 3 feet. For Wednesday, the Alaska Peninsula, west-southwest winds 15 to 20 knots. Bristol Bay, southwest winds at 20 knots. And Kodiak Island, west winds 30 knots, seas 6 to 8 feet. For the eastern Aleutians on Tuesday, southeast winds and east-southeast winds at 20 to 25 knots. Central Aleutians, winds will be southeast at 25 knots, east 25 knots for the Amchitka Island area, and from Kiska to Shemya, north winds 25 knots. Western Aleutians on Wednesday, southeast winds at 20. Central Aleutians, southeast winds 20 to 25 knots. And for the eastern Aleutians, south to southeast winds at 20 to 25 knots. For the southwest coast, Winds will be out of the east there south of Nunivak Island at only 10 knots with 3-foot seas. Otherwise, for St. Paul and St. George, southeast winds at 20 knots with 6-foot seas, and small craft advisories for St. Matthew Island, where winds will be southeast at 25 knots with 11-foot seas. And the Yukon Delta coast, southeast winds 20 knots. St. Lawrence Island, south winds 25 knots, seas 8 feet. Then for Wednesday, St. Lawrence Island, west winds 25 knots with 8-foot seas. And the Pribilof, south at 20, southwest 20 for the Kuskokwim Delta coast, Yukon Delta coast, southeast winds 25 knots. St. Matthew Island, southeast winds at 20. For the eastern Beaufort Sea coast on Tuesday, west-southwest winds 20 knots, southwest at 20 for the central coast. And for the western Arctic coast, Chukchi Sea, south winds 30 to 35 knots. And for the day Wednesday, for the Chukchi Sea, west winds at 30 knots. For the western Arctic coast, southwest winds 30 knots. And then the central coast, southwest at 15, and pretty light winds there for the eastern Beaufort Sea coastline, south to southeast at 10 knots. For tonight, strong high pressure over toward the eastern border keeps it clear and cold over just about all of interior Alaska, maybe a few flurries along the central Arctic coast, but light rain with a warm front out over the central Aleutians, and then some moisture starting to work in toward St. Lawrence Island, but may not make it until tomorrow. And the Panhandle, increasing north and northeast winds as that low drops southeastward to west of the Queen Charlotte's there late tonight. And for the day Tuesday, that low continues to move down toward the Vancouver Island area. Strong high pressure over the Yukon and strong winds, gale force, possibly storm force gusts there over the northern Panhandle, with high wind warnings out. And clear and cold interior Alaska, maybe some flurries along the Arctic coast into the Bering Strait to St. Lawrence Island. Rain over the western central Aleutians. And for Wednesday, cold front brings snow into the western interior all the way up, covering the Arctic coast north slope areas.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.